In the dense jungles of Vietnam in the 1960s and early 1970s, war did not always come in the form of tanks, jets, or artillery. For many soldiers, the most terrifying enemy was something they could not see. A hidden stake beneath the soil, a wire stretched across a trail, a dark hole in the ground, or the sudden rustle of bamboo just before pain and darkness. In this conflict, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces turned the very earth, plants, and animals of Vietnam into weapons. Their booby traps, mines, and underground tunnels became symbols of a war where danger was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The Vietnam War was fundamentally unequal in terms of technology and firepower. The United States and its South Vietnamese allies had helicopters, napalm, heavy artillery, and advanced weapons. The Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla movement in the South supported by North Vietnam, had far fewer resources. But they had something else: intimate knowledge of the land, the ability to blend into the local population, and a deep understanding of how fear could be used as a weapon. Drawing on principles that echo the ancient strategist Sun Tzu, who wrote that all warfare is based on deception, they built a strategy that relied on ambushes, traps, and surprise rather than direct confrontation. One of the foundations of this strategy lay beneath the ground. In regions like Siu Kai, northwest of Saigon, the Viet Cong carved out a hidden world. Over years of digging, they created a vast network of tunnels that eventually stretched for hundreds of kilometers. These tunnels were not just escape routes. They were living spaces, supply lines, command centers, field hospitals, classrooms, and armories. Villagers worked alongside guerrillas, digging in secret at night, carrying away soil in baskets, and cleverly disguising the entrances. Inside the Siu Kai tunnels, life was harsh. The passages were narrow and low, often barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. Air was hot and stale. Light came from flickering lanterns, if at all. Rats, insects, snakes, and disease were constant companions. Yet the Viet Cong learned to live down there for days or even weeks at a time. They cooked underground with special chimneys that dispersed smoke so it would rise far from the actual kitchen. They held meetings, treated wounded fighters, stored weapons, and waited for the right moment to emerge, strike, and then disappear again. The layout of the tunnels was carefully designed to confuse and protect. There were multiple levels, with some sections shallow for quick movement and others deeper for protection against bombs and artillery. Many entrances were hidden under the floors of simple houses, inside thickets of bushes, under termite mounds, or even beneath the water of rice paddies. Some had trapdoors sealed with clay and camouflaged with leaves. Others were flooded or blocked to mislead intruders. Ventilation shafts were disguised as natural holes in the ground. The tunnels themselves were ringed with lethal obstacles: concealed pits, plunger stakes, and explosive booby traps placed where an advancing soldier might never think to look. For much of the early war, American and South Vietnamese forces did not fully understand this hidden network. Patrols would encounter sudden small arms fire, then find nothing. An enemy would appear, fire a few shots, and vanish. It was only in the early 1960s that the true scale of the tunnels began to be revealed. Large operations were launched to locate and destroy them. Bulldozers scraped away jungle. Bombers dropped explosive payloads. Flamethrowers were used to try to burn out the underground positions. But the tunnels were resilient. Their zigzagging structure helped absorb shockwaves. New sections were dug when old ones collapsed. And for every entrance that was destroyed, one or two more could be created. To fight this subterranean enemy, special units of soldiers emerged. The so-called tunnel rats. These were usually smaller, agile volunteers who were willing to go down into the darkness with little more than a flashlight, a pistol, and their nerves. Crawling through cramped passages where a wrong movement could trigger a mine or a hidden trap, they searched for caches, command posts, and enemy fighters. The danger was extreme. At any moment, they could find a live Viet Cong soldier, a snake placed in a side chamber, a tripwire, or a depression lined with spikes. Many tunnel rats later described the experience as one of the most terrifying roles in the war. The silence, the heat, the smell of damp earth and sweat, and the knowledge that every inch might conceal sudden death created a unique and lasting psychological strain. Above ground, the Viet Cong's most notorious weapons were their traps. Cheap to build and simple to operate, they turned basic materials into instruments of terrible efficiency. The most infamous of these devices was the plunger stake. Plunger stakes were sharpened bamboo spikes, set upright in concealed pits or fixed at angles along likely paths of movement. Sometimes they were placed at the bottom of deep holes covered with a thin layer of branches and soil, ready to impale any soldier who stepped on what looked like solid ground. In other cases, they were positioned sideways in small, camouflaged trenches, designed to pierce the legs or feet of a man who slipped or fell. To increase the damage, the tips of these spikes were often smeared with substances that would cause infection: mud, animal excrement, or rotting organic matter. In the humid climate of Vietnam, even a small wound could quickly become life-threatening if not treated properly. A soldier stepping on a plunger stake might survive the initial injury, but infection could keep him out of combat for weeks, strain medical resources, and add to the sense of vulnerability felt by his unit. Plunger stakes had been used earlier against French colonial forces in the First Indochina War, but during the Vietnam conflict they became more elaborate. Some traps were designed with hinged floors that would collapse under weight, swinging a soldier into a nest of spikes. Others used spring-loaded mechanisms so that when a wire was tripped, a board lined with stakes would swing up, smashing into legs, groins, or torsos. In some designs, bamboo spikes were arranged at different angles so that any attempt to pull a wounded man out of the pit would cause additional tearing and pain. For soldiers moving through the jungle, the threat was ever present. Many veterans later recalled the constant tension of scanning the ground, watching each step, and fearing that a single misplaced foot could end in catastrophe. To counter these traps, American and South Vietnamese forces developed special footwear with thicker, reinforced soles meant to resist punctures. They also adopted new patrol tactics, sending scouts ahead to probe suspicious areas. Sometimes long sticks, bayonets, or specialized metal rods called probes were used to test the soil. But the Viet Cong adapted as well, placing traps in unexpected places or using thinner, sharper spikes to defeat new footwear. It became a deadly game of move and countermove. Booby traps and landmines were another crucial part of the Viet Cong arsenal. Some were factory-made mines acquired through supply routes from the north or captured from enemy stockpiles. Others were improvised from artillery shells, mortar rounds, or unexploded bombs. One of the most feared types was the bounding mine, often referred to by American troops as a bouncing Betty, from a German design first used in World War II. When triggered by a tripwire or pressure, the mine would leap into the air before detonating at about waist height, sending fragments in all directions and inflicting horrific injuries on anyone nearby. Alongside such mines were smaller devices sometimes called toe poppers, compact charges or improvised mines designed primarily to maim. Losing a foot or lower leg often meant a lifetime of disability. From the Viet Cong perspective, wounding a soldier could be more strategically effective than killing him outright, because it required evacuation, medical treatment, and emotional support from comrades, tying up resources and spreading fear. Booby traps took many forms. A common design was a hand grenade rigged in a tin can or tied to a branch, with a cord or wire connected to the safety pin. When a soldier brushed against the wire or stepped on the can, the pin would be pulled, and the grenade would explode seconds later. Sometimes grenades were attached under doors, to boxes, or to apparently abandoned equipment, turning curiosity and routine actions into lethal mistakes. Other traps were disguised as harmless objects. A rock that could be kicked, a bundle of sticks, or a patch of foliage concealing a tripwire or pressure plate. In the dense undergrowth and confusion of combat, such devices were extremely hard to detect. Stories circulated among the troops of men who lost limbs, eyes, or their lives to these invisible dangers. The psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers learned to fear not only direct enemy fire, but also the ground beneath their feet, the trees beside them, and even objects they might pick up. Every step, every movement, every touch could be the last. Some veterans later described it as living in a constant coin toss between life and death. Net traps and falling traps added a different dimension to the threat. In some cases, the Viet Cong created man-catcher traps. Large nets hidden on the ground and attached to ropes and counterweights. When a soldier stepped on the net, the mechanism would activate, snapping the net closed and pulling the victim off the ground, suspending him in the air. A man tangled in a net was temporarily helpless, an easy target for further attack or capture. Even if he was quickly rescued by his unit, the incident reinforced the lesson that the environment itself could not be trusted. Falling traps, sometimes known as tiger pits or spike pits, were dreaded by many soldiers. These were deep holes dug into the earth, lined with sharpened stakes of bamboo or metal. The top was covered with a thin layer of branches, grass, or soil to make it appear solid. When someone stepped on it, the cover collapsed, and the person fell onto the spikes below. In some pits, Spikes were angled inward so that when a man was pulled up, the stakes tore flesh even further. In others, spikes were positioned to target specific parts of the body, like the legs or torso. As with plunger stakes, the points were often contaminated to cause infection. Extracting a wounded soldier from such a trap could be extremely difficult and traumatic, sometimes requiring cutting or snapping spikes while they were still embedded in the victim's body. On top of these mechanical and explosive devices, the Viet Cong also weaponized living creatures and basic necessities. Snakes, scorpions, and other venomous animals were sometimes used as natural tools of terror. A snake could be placed in a hollow log, a pack, or a small suspended basket rigged to drop when a door opened or a wire was tripped. A scorpion could be confined under a bowl or in a container that would overturn if someone moved a particular object. At night, when soldiers tried to rest, the fear of something live and deadly sharing their sleeping space made true rest elusive. There were accounts of troops being bitten in the dark, waking up in panic to find a snake or scorpion on their body. Even when anti-venom or medical evacuation saved their lives, the experience often left deep psychological scars. The idea that the enemy could turn nature itself against them, plants, pits, insects, and reptiles, added a new layer of dread to an already hostile environment. Sabotage of food and water was another method used to undermine morale. Retreating units might leave behind stores of rice, canned goods, or water containers that had been deliberately contaminated. Soldiers who found such supplies might assume they had captured something useful, only to become violently ill later. Although not every story of poisoned food could be confirmed, the possibility alone forced troops to be suspicious of anything they found. Water sources had to be checked, sometimes boiled or treated. Field kitchens had to monitor ingredients carefully. The basic routines of eating and drinking, simple acts that sustain life, were shadowed by doubt. Wire-based traps demonstrated the Viet Cong's ability to use minimal materials to maximum effect. In some designs, a thin wire was connected to a bent sapling or bamboo stalk under tension. At the other end of the sapling, the Viet Cong attached a board lined with spikes, a sharpened metal hook, or a cluster of barbs. The free end was held in place by a trigger mechanism, often another length of wire across a trail. When a soldier's leg or foot caught the tripwire, the tension was released, and the sapling snapped back at high speed, driving the spikes or hook into the victim's body. These so-called whip traps were often aimed at knee height or lower, targeting legs, groins, and lower backs, inflicting crippling injuries in a fraction of a second. Another variety used sloping ground. A patch of earth might be carefully smoothed and covered with leaves to form a hidden slide, with a tripwire at the top. If a soldier tripped the wire, he lost his balance and slid down the slope into a pit, onto spikes, or against other hidden obstacles. In tricky terrain, muddy hillsides, riverbanks, narrow paths, such traps could be almost impossible to detect beforehand. Facing this growing array of threats, American and South Vietnamese forces were forced to adapt. Military training began to emphasize not just marksmanship and conventional tactics, but also the art of moving through a hostile environment saturated with traps. New recruits were shown examples of capture devices, taught to recognize disturbed soil, unnatural arrangements of vegetation, or suspicious gaps in brush. They learned to expect danger in places that would normally seem safe. Along well-worn trails, at likely rest spots, on the edges of clearings, or near river crossings. Engineers and specialists studied captured traps and developed countermeasures. Simple metal probes became standard tools for patrols, allowing soldiers to test the ground ahead. Minesweepers using detectors and bayonets walked in front of columns, scanning for buried metal and faint wires. Dogs were trained to sense human presence and disturbed earth, often identifying dangers long before a human eye could see them. Some units developed drills for moving through jungle in scattered, irregular formations rather than tight columns, to reduce the risk that a single explosive device would hit multiple men. Protective gear also evolved. Boots with thicker soles, reinforced with metal or special materials, were issued. Some units adopted improved body armor designed to mitigate shrapnel damage from mines and grenades. Helmets and flak jackets, while far from perfect, gave soldiers at least some reassurance amid the constant danger. Helicopter tactics were adjusted, with more emphasis on aerial insertion and extraction to limit time spent on foot in trap-ridden areas, though even landing zones could be mined or booby-trapped. Despite all these efforts, the traps remained a deadly and demoralizing part of daily life. Soldiers learned that they could do everything right and still be unlucky. They could watch their step, follow every guideline, and move carefully, only to see a comrade hit a wire or fall into a pit. Over time, this chipped away at morale. Some units grew slower and more cautious, not because they were cowardly, but because they understood the real, invisible threats that surrounded them. Others developed a grim fatalism, accepting that survival involved luck as well as skill. The Viet Cong's use of deception and traps was part of a much broader historical pattern. Throughout centuries of warfare, weaker or outnumbered forces have turned to subterfuge to level the playing field. In the Korean War, decades earlier, North Korean and Chinese units used camouflage, hidden positions, and surprise attacks in mountainous terrain to offset the technological superiority of their opponents. In the Second World War, both the Allies and the Axis powers relied on deception. Inflatable tanks, false radio messages, fake armies created on maps to mislead enemy intelligence. Operations like the Allied deception preceding the invasion of Normandy, and the British effort known as Operation Mincemeat, showed that manipulating what the enemy believed could be as powerful as destroying what the enemy possessed. Even in much older history, stories like the Trojan horse illustrate how attackers could triumph not by brute force alone but by tricking defenders into opening their gates. Across cultures, commanders have recognized that fear, confusion, and uncertainty can weaken even well-armed armies. The Viet Cong's traps were a modern expression of this timeless principle, adapted to the thick jungles, muddy rice paddies, and narrow village paths of Southeast Asia. The consequences of this kind of warfare did not end when the guns fell silent. When the conflict in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos subsided, countless mines, unexploded bombs, and abandoned traps remained scattered across fields, forests, and villages. Some devices rusted and became inert. Others remained deadly for years or even decades. Farmers plowing their fields, children playing, or villagers gathering firewood sometimes triggered explosions long after the war had ended. Limbs were lost, lives were shattered, and communities were scarred anew by remnants of a conflict they had not chosen. In response, teams of demonists and volunteers emerged, often former fighters themselves, dedicating their lives to finding and removing mines and unexploded ordnance. They moved slowly through contaminated areas, probing the soil, carefully disarming or safely detonating what they found. Their work was painstaking and dangerous, but vital for restoring land to safe use. Museums, education centers, and awareness programs arose to teach local populations how to recognize and avoid dangerous objects, and to remind visitors that war's legacy can persist long after the last battle. For the soldiers who faced these traps during the war, the impact was both physical and psychological. Some returned home with missing limbs, scars, or chronic pain from injuries sustained in pits, blasts, or whip traps. Others carried invisible wounds. Nightmares of falling into darkness, flashes of memory at the sound of a snapping branch or a sudden bang, a reluctance to walk on uneven ground or enter thick forests. Their memories often focused less on the large battles and more on the constant, low-level terror of not knowing where the next danger lay. Many veterans later spoke of how the traps changed the way they saw the world. Something as simple as walking down a path could trigger memories of scanning the ground, searching for wires or disturbed soil. A creaking floorboard or a hidden step could evoke the moment when a pit cover collapsed or a wire tugged at their leg. For some, these associations faded with time. For others, they remained sharp and painful, part of the personal cost of serving in that war. On the other side, former Viet Cong fighters recalled the labor and ingenuity that went into making and placing traps. They spoke of nights spent digging, carving spikes, rigging wires, and learning from older comrades how to place devices where enemy behavior patterns made them most likely to be triggered. For them, traps were not just instruments of terror but tools of survival against a far stronger enemy. They saw themselves as using whatever means were available to defend their land and achieve their goals, guided by a doctrine that emphasized patience, creativity, and the careful use of limited resources. Yet even among those who built and deployed such devices, there were mixed feelings. Some later acknowledged the cruelty of traps that caused agonizing injuries. They knew that the people who fell into pits, stepped on mines, or were caught in whip traps were often young men, far from home, who did not fully understand the political forces that had brought them to Vietnam. The war forced both sides into roles where empathy and humanity were often pushed aside for the sake of survival and victory. The story of Viet Cong traps in the Vietnam War is therefore more than just a catalogue of devices. It is a story about the nature of asymmetric warfare, where one side compensates for material inferiority with creativity, local knowledge, and psychological pressure. It is a story about how fear can become a battlefield all its own, shaping decisions, influencing tactics, and leaving long-term marks on those who experience it. It is also a story about the enduring consequences of war, both for the land where it is fought and for the people, combatants and civilians alike, who must live with its aftermath. When we imagine war, we often think of visible clashes. Soldiers advancing, tanks firing, jets streaking across the sky. But in Vietnam, for many, war meant something quieter and more personal. The careful placement of a foot, the careful reach of a hand, the careful decision of whether to pick up an object lying in the dirt. It meant walking through a world where the danger was hidden beneath leaves, underwater, inside a tree, or below a patch of ground that looked perfectly safe. For those who walked those trails and survived, the memory of that unseen menace has never completely faded. And for those who study the conflict today, the traps of the Vietnam War serve as a stark reminder that ingenuity in warfare can be both impressive and horrifying. Simple materials, bamboo, wire, wood, and soil, combined with patience and knowledge of human behavior, can produce effects as profound as any high-tech weapon. In the end, the Viet Cong's use of tunnels and traps did not by itself determine the political outcome of the war, but it profoundly shaped the experience of fighting it. It forced a superpower to confront an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, that fought not only with bullets but with fear. It turned the landscape itself into a silent combatant, and it left behind a legacy of scars, both visible and invisible, etched into the bodies of veterans, the soil of Southeast Asia, and the historical record of a complex and painful conflict.